So this video is the first of our civil rights unit. So first, let's start by talking about what are civil rights. So in our last unit, we said that civil liberties are going to be protections from the government. So civil rights are going to be protections by the government. So civil rights protect individuals from discrimination based on race, national origin, religion, sex, and other characteristics. So this is going to include the fundamental rights of individuals to be treated equally under the laws and policies of governments. So essentially, civil rights are going to be those rights to equal treatment that all people are guaranteed. So it is going to be the government's responsibility to protect people from being discriminated against based on being a member of a certain group or any other kind of personal characteristics. So civil rights are going to require positive action by the government to protect individuals from discrimination. So let's go back to the end of the Civil War, okay, where the Union is going to win over the Confederate States, okay? So at the end of the Civil War, Southern states are going to begin passing laws to preserve the status quo between whites and African Americans, okay? So obviously the Southern states are going to be unhappy that they have lost the war. So they are going to start enacting what are called black codes. And this is going to be their way to try to keep the status quo based on social and economic integration of free slaves. So they are going to try to restrict the political and economic rights of African Americans. So these black codes will limit the type of property African Americans could own, restrict labor and activity, and they are going to be enforced by Confederate veterans. So after the war, these black codes are going to end up leading to amendments being added to the Constitution to protect the civil rights of African Americans. So the first of those is the 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, and it prohibits slavery in the United States. The next is the 14th Amendment, and this one is a really important one that we'll be talking a lot about during this unit. And it is from 1868, and it affirms the citizenship to those born in the United States. So it reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. So that last little part, that equal protection part, we're going to talk about that more in just a few minutes. And then the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, is going to grant voting rights to African American men. Now, it is important to note here that it is African American men, so women do not yet have the right to vote. So let's talk a little more about these civil rights amendments. So as I said, in the 14th Amendment, it is going to include the Equal Protection Clause. And this amendment is going to be used to protect the civil rights of Americans from discrimination based on race, national origin, religion, or gender. So this idea of having equal protection under the law. So the Equal Protection Clause, it has been interpreted to require the federal government to address and prevent any discriminatory practices. So this idea that everyone is equal under the law, regardless of race, national origin, religion, or gender. Another thing to keep in mind is that the amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, were not passed unopposed. So Southerners are still going to be unhappy. And this is going to lead to Jim Crow laws in the South. Okay, so these Jim Crow laws are going to segregate whites and African Americans in many different ways. But some examples would be separate public facilities. So this includes separate restrooms as well as separate drinking fountains. Interracial marriage is going to be illegal at this time. And it's also going to require poll taxes, literacy tests, and the grandfather clause. So for example, poll taxes mean that African Americans are going to have to pay a tax before they are able to vote. Most of them are not going to be able to do so, so therefore they won't be able to vote. Some states will require literacy tests for African Americans to be able to vote. Most of these African Americans had previously been slaves, or their parents or grandparents had been slaves. They did not have that opportunity for education, so they're unable to pass these literacy tests. and therefore unable to vote. Or there is a grandfather clause, which said that you are only going to be allowed to vote if your grandfather was able to vote. Well, these people's grandparents had been slaves. They weren't able to vote. So there are going to be Jim Crow laws that are going to try to essentially get around those amendments that were added to the Constitution. So let's talk about a case, Plessy v. Ferguson, okay? And this is going to deal with segregation. So this case takes place in 1896, and this isn't a required case, but it's important to understand for another required case. So at this time, Louisiana is going to enact the Separate Car Act, which requires separate railway cars for blacks and whites. So again, this is part of segregation. So another example of how facilities for whites and African Americans have to be separate. So Homer Plessy, who you see right here, who was 7/8 Caucasian, agreed to test the act by sitting in a whites-only train car. So he is biracial, okay, 7/8 Caucasian, so 1/8 African American, and he's going to try to test this act by sitting in a whites-only car. So under state law, Plessy was considered African American. So when he was told to vacate the all-white car, he is going to refuse and be arrested. So the court is going to rule that this law in Louisiana is not violating that 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause by declaring that separate but equal facilities are legal. Okay, so as long as the accommodations provided to African Americans were substantially the same as those provided to whites, legal segregation is constitutional. So the majority is going to state that the amendment intended to establish absolute equality for the races before the law. So as long as they are equal, segregation is fine. Okay, separate treatment does not imply inferiority, is what the court is ruling in this case. However, the dissent, okay, that doesn't agree with the majority opinion, is going to argue that the Constitution does not tolerate classes amongst citizens. So the important thing to know about Plessy v. Ferguson is that it is upholding separate but equal, upholding segregation. So Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP. So Thurgood Marshall and the National Association for Advancement of Colored People are going to launch an attack on legal segregation. Okay, so at this point, you remember all of those facilities are separate, schools are separate. So this is going to include separation by law of white and African American children in schools. So at this point, school segregation exists. So Marshall is going to serve as a special counsel who had to prove there was no possibility for equality in segregated education. So at this point, the Supreme Court is going to have to declare that school segregation was inherently unequal and violated the Constitution. Okay, so he is going to have to prove that African American children and white children are not getting equal opportunities within education that would actually violate the Constitution at this point. So let's talk about a really important case, and this is one of the cases that you are required to know for the AP exam. So this is Brown v. Board of Education, and this takes place in 1954. So this starts when Oliver Brown is going to try to enroll his daughter Linda, who is a third grader, in an all-white elementary school that was closer to her home than the all-black school that she was forced to go to. So because she wasn't able to go to that all-white elementary school that was close to her home, she is going to have to walk through a busy and dangerous rail yard. Okay, so she's having to walk several blocks to an all-black school instead of going to the closer white school. So this is very unsafe for an 8 or 9-year-old child to have to walk to school this way. So Brown's request is going to be denied, okay? And he, after losing in state court, he is going to appeal to the Supreme Court to strike down these laws requiring school segregation. So previous courts had ruled that evidence demonstrated that black and white children were equal in their educational potential. However, Marshall is going to introduce social science demonstrating the physiological harm of segregation. So his study had children picking baby dolls, okay, essentially. And instead of picking the African American dolls that looked like them, they would always pick the white doll, okay? And it was just this idea that within children, they were already starting to believe that one race was better than the other, okay? So this is going to be part of his way of proving that segregated education is inherently unequal. So, in the court's ruling, the court is going to overturn that Plessy v. Ferguson precedent, ruling that separate but equal facilities are inherently unequal and violate the protections of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Okay, so African American students who attend separate schools by law are being denied educational opportunities and benefits that they would be given in an integrated setting, even if their school facilities and teachers were roughly equal. Furthermore, the negative message of segregation towards African American students is going to be harmful to their education and self-worth. So, segregation of public education based on race is going to instill a sense of inferiority that had detrimental effect on the education and growth of African American children. So, Plessy v. Ferguson upheld separate but equal. Brown v. Board of Education is going to overturn separate but equal and be the start to the end of school segregation. All right, and that's where we're going to stop.